Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Kyle Dauterman, and here with me today is
Erin, Brisbin.
Matt, Brisbin.
And Erik, Knoedler.
And today we're talking about sort of the situation in education with grades, and talking about new systems of grading and getting education away from trying to get a grade and more towards learning. So with that being said, how do we shift the culture in education away from grades and towards actual learning for students?
I think it starts with just in classrooms putting the focus on learning and talking about learning and de-emphasizing the grade and de-emphasizing points and not always worrying about how many points are in the grade book or how many points do you need to do this or this is worth this many points. So it's really, from my perspective, talking with students about what have you learned and how can you show that as opposed to how many points can you get.
Absolutely. I noticed that a lot in my classes. It's all about how many points something is worth. I accidentally made something worth 3,050 points yesterday. I didn't bother to change it, but they were really concerned that that was actually what it was worth. And I was like, of course it's not, guys. It was a reflection about the last podcast. And they thought, oh, is this going to ruin my grade? I was like, guys, do you think I actually was going to make something worth 3,000 points?
I often joke with my students because they know that we use a gradeless system. And by the end of the year, this time of the year, they always come in and they check in, hey, I can't come to class tomorrow. What are we going to be doing? What am I going to miss? And I always tell them, like, we've got a quiz that's worth 1,000,000 points and you can't make it up tomorrow. So sorry, but you now have an F-. And I think that story just kind of goes to show, like, if you can sort of make light of how arbitrary and silly grades can be, that helps to really emphasize that class needs to be about learning. And it's really not about grades at all, because I think where we are in education today, it becomes something that people aren't even aware of. Grades are so ubiquitous that, most teachers and students, unless they really think about it and have done the research on it, they don't even realize that grades are really getting in the way of their learning. They just look at them as one and the same.
Absolutely.
And so, like, really breaking down the ways in which grades get in the way of that learning process for students, and how we can learn how to continue learning without having to use that same sort of archaic system is really a difficult process at first, but so important to the success of this kind of system working, I think.
And I think that really, like, when you think about it and you think about learning, it's actually harder to quantify into numbers. Like, it's much harder to say, if we're trying to see, like, can a student do this or does a student understand this? They understand 8 out of 10 of it. Like what does that even mean? So I think that I really go out of my way to actually never say the word grade, like, in everything. I don't say grade. I don't say points. I don't say anything like that. And always talk about what your goal is or your objective is or what the target is. And I think that's an important shift.
Yeah, quantifying things doesn't really help, in my opinion. And I sort of agree with that we talk in numbers, but numbers aren't good at sort of quantifying how much you learn. 8 out of 10 of something doesn't really make a lot of sense. So in that way, would you guys say that you think that grades get in the way of actual learning? Do you think that do you think it's an actual barrier? Do you think that rather than it is this system that we take so much for granted, but do you now think it's sort of a roadblock for educators to get through and for students to get through?
I would say just in using a non-traditional system for the last few years, I've noticed a big difference in students willing to take risks and being okay with doing something and then not doing it well, because they're not worried about how many points are going to go in the grade book, and they don't do it well. And then it's like, oh, I see, I get it. I know why I didn't do well. And it allows them to make, like, drastic changes in what they're doing. And one of the specific examples I can think of are the document-based questions that students write in AP history classes, and they are extremely hard And before, when I was putting a point total in the grade book, it would just devastate kids' grades because honestly, they shouldn't be able to get 100%. And now they're willing to take the risk and try and know that, like, okay, I didn't do well this time, but what I need to do is show growth and I need to improve. And if I'm doing that, I'm learning. And they see that too. I think the kids have really, they feel more confident, they feel less stressed, and they are learning.
Absolutely.
It's kind of so kids love playing video games, and they would hate playing video games if they were easy, if they could just beat them on the first time they played it, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things about video games is they're difficult, and when you fail, you actually learn how to get better at the game. It takes multiple iterations, multiple times playing through as a level or being able to figure out what skill set you need to be able to get to the end. And that's fun because there's nothing really riding on it, right? But as soon as you introduce like extrinsic motivators, then that shuts things down. And that could be a motivator, but it could also be a punishment, right? And I think grades work both ways. Mm-hmm. And so when you can take that away, kids can see failure as a way to improve. And it's such a necessary part of learning to be able to do something the wrong way and figure out what you did wrong so that you can do it right the next time. And I think that's a really important piece of this too. And so those are just some like anecdotal, responses, but I think research also shows that anytime you introduce these extrinsic motivators, it narrows a student's focus, right? And it doesn't allow them to think in creative ways, and it doesn't allow them to think critically like we want them to be able to do, And so because they're always focused on what's the right answer, it sort of limits their abilities, it limits their capacity, right? And so when you take that away, it frees them up to be able to fully engage and fully explore all of the different areas of their learning that they would oftentimes be shut off to previously.
Yeah, and I think that I like the video game analogy where you say you can see progress, like I got to this point in the game or this point in the game. And it's not, again, with numbers where you're like, hey, I averaged all of the numbers that you got, and this is the number that comes from the numbers. And again, what does that mean, right? Instead of saying like, oh, okay, I got to this point, I got to this point, I got to this point. And students will see, okay, well, this time I didn't get there or I fell back a little bit. But it's that like journey, more than it is, oh no, this ruined my grade, right? It's like, okay, well, hey, you hit that bump in the road. It's not going to be part of an average of numbers, right? Let's see where you get to the end. And there is a much more, I don't know if I would say positive, but maybe like kids shrug it off. If they look at something, it's like, oh, I didn't do well on this. And they kind of go, oh, well, and they specifically look at what do I need to do to get better the next time,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that I notice about these grading systems that is odd because we don't do this. Okay, so I'm a big baseball fan. You never look at the worst game that a player plays, right? Some days you may bat 5 times, you may strike out 5 times. And it's not like you're a bad baseball player that day. It wasn't your day. And there may be a day that you hit 5 home runs. You're also not the greatest person to ever play baseball, right? You're somewhere in the middle. And in education, what we do is we weight that day where you struck out 5 times very heavily. And we also weight that day where you had 5 home runs very heavily. And we don't really get an accurate representation because the extremes always pull grades one way or another. If you really bomb an essay, that's your 5 strikeout day, you may not be able to recover from it. And it may demotivate a student to actually want to try in the future. And it's odd because in all other situations of life, we don't look at extremes like that. We say, that was an extreme. That wasn't likely to happen again. But in the case of education, we take those to be very serious. You don't write a good essay, it's a problem. Now your grade's going to tank. You write a great essay. Now I'm going to have an A for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I'm going to ride on my laurels. I'm not going to actually try. It's It seems weird that we're one of the few systems that really looks at those outliers.
You know, and I think that also what's kind of funny is the students a lot of times will put so much emphasis on the numbers, but at the same time, the numbers don't mean anything, because how many times students come to you and say, oh, I have an 89.4%. Can you round that up to an A? And I would always tell students, well, what's the point? Like, what is that rounding up? And if that's what you're going to do, why not do it at 89%? Why not do it at 88%? Why not do it at 85%? Like, where is where's that line? And again, if that's your focus, like, again, what does it mean? I guess, I don't know. Sometimes I get all philosophical with students and annoy them. I'm like, what does it mean exactly? But
Yeah.
truthfully, like, what does it mean?
The further I've gotten into using a gradeless system, the more arbitrary numbers feel to me. But I also look at this from like a historical perspective, and our education system was created in an industrial era for a specific purpose, and they used this 100-point scale because it was a way to easily like quantify, and they were trying to see like how many pieces of something can someone make on a assembly line. Where we live in a completely different world, one where things like critical thinking and collaboration are so much more important. And so I often think about like, how come our system has not changed at all, even though the education system hasn't changed at all, even though the world has changed so much?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, critical thinking wasn't necessarily a necessary skill set that an assembly line worker needed.
Yeah.
But in the world that we live in today, it's an absolute necessity. If you want to be successful in almost anything, you need to be able to problem solve and work collaboratively. And, like Erik and Erin have both said, as soon as you start to introduce numbers into the equation, it shuts down any kind of feedback system, And I remember my first few years of teaching as an English teacher. I used to just stay up all hours of the night trying to give feedback to students on their essays. And I'd write like paragraphs at the end of every single essay, thinking that students were going to like read this and internalize it and like make some kind of learning growth the next time. And what happened is they looked at the score on the top of the essay and then threw it in the recycle bin. Mm-hmm. And then like, that was it. They were like, oh man, I got a B this time. I hope I get an A on the next one.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but you didn't even read any of the feedback. And so I would kill myself leaving hours and hours of feedback for students. And I realized that as soon as you put a number on something, it short circuits the whole system. Now, if I had never put a score on the top of their essay, that might have forced them to have to read all of that feedback too. Mm-hmm. And so, it's really one of those things where if you can disrupt any notion of numbers or averages or percentages, I think that's really the first step necessary in putting the onus back onto learning and taking it away from grades.
It's incredibly difficult, though, because our system has instilled this within students since at least middle school. And so that's what they know. It's what parents know. It's what teachers know. It's what's comfortable. It feels like, okay, I got an 87%. That's a B. And to us, having done something different, we're going, what does 87% even mean? But it's what society has created. And so it's incredibly difficult for others sometimes to understand how this works, or the goal, our shift to try to really focus on learning.
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, we can all agree that the point of school is to create young people who are educated. I mean, that's what we are. We call ourselves educators. But at the end of the day, sometimes we feel like arbiters to grades, right? We're like, especially teachers that are completely still in old systems, like myself, not in a gradeless system. And I found that all of my conversations during conferences today and yesterday revolve primarily around what the letter grade in eSchool says, not how much the student has grown. There are students who have C's in my podcasting classes who have really grown, who maybe were scared of the podcast room, did not want to talk, did not want to be social with other students, and have now maybe done one or two podcasts. Maybe they're not the greatest podcasts ever produced, but they've done something. But the way that my system is set up does not account for the starting line. It only accounts for the finish line. It only accounts for where they should be, but it does not say like, okay, this person was having a real trouble with this. It's a very impersonal, very cold system, which does not, I think, does not lend itself towards that growth and actual learning. So looking at that question when we talked about shifting towards actual learning, and we've sort of been touching on this a little bit, but let's kind of go at it a more deliberate way. What are some of the issues and what were some of the reasons that you went away from a traditional grading system? What do you think about traditional grading systems being demotivating? And specifically thinking about how students have sort of a destructive relationship with grades. Because I certainly think that even the most cynical of educator can see that students do not have a good relationship with grades, especially now that they are digitized. When they are online and that they are accessible 24/7, it's become this culture, especially if you're not a teacher, you don't understand that students being able to check their grades all the time sounds great, but I think it is one of the most destructive mental health practices that we have implemented. It means that they track them 24/7. Tell me a little bit about what you think about that. Feel free to hop in.
I tell students sometimes that, I say, when I was a kid, like, you got a progress report, but until the progress report came out, it's like, how are you doing? I don't know. Like, I think okay, maybe. Like, unless you went out of your way to go talk to the teacher, and even then, you might go talk to the teacher, and the teacher goes, well, I have all these numbers in the grade book. I haven't averaged them yet, so I don't know. So, like, nobody knows. But, I think I remember when I first started thinking about this, it was because Matt was talking at, we had a staff meeting or something, and was talking about how, there are the kids that aren't doing well and they give up. But then you also have, on the other side of things, kids that say things like, well, I have such a high grade in this class, I don't even have to take the final, and that's what they're actually shooting for, right? They're not shooting for, like, can I do this, or how well can I do this, or what else can I do? But it's like, do I have that number? And it seems like, is there the number where I give up? And the weird thing is, I got 101% because there's extra credit. And that's a number where I can give up. Or a student has, I missed this, I missed that. My number, whatever it means, is 30%. That means I give up. So, like, it seems like there is again, or a student says, like, well, I can't get any higher than this, so I'm not going to do anything else. And again, it seems like numbers have this point where students figure out where it is, where you can just stop.
That's just like the classic example of, a classroom culture being about grades and not about learning, right? If students really are in the class to learn, they're not going to stop. And I think if the purpose for them is to get a specific grade and there's no way for them to improve or to get worse, then they'll stop. And so I think therein lies one of the most destructive practices, right, is because as a society, we tell them that their grades matter a lot. Like, we give them scholarships that are incredibly valuable because they have high grades. Students are given entrance into colleges because they have high grades and good transcripts and high test scores and all of these things. And those are the things that as a society we say matter. And really, as a society, it just means that we're too lazy to, like, put in the time to really talk about what a student can do and to put in that, give them a narrative to describe their skill sets. That would take way too long in a system where each of us have 150 students. So we throw a number in there, hoping that people kind of know and have an idea of what that means, and it can really make a huge difference in a student's future. So I don't blame students or parents, for that matter, for caring so much about grades. And it's unfortunate that a system has become so influential that it has literally changed the focus of education away from learning and back onto, these numbers that are relatively arbitrary.
I want to go back, excuse me, to the original question of, like, what made you want to change what you were doing. And for me, I agree with everything Matt and Erik are saying, but I remember vividly, my daughter was probably 5 or 6, and she had a million questions about everything. And I would ask, what questions do you have, to my students? And they would just stare at me like with, blank eyes. And that was one thing. And then when I had students that started coming into my classroom in tears, like literally crying because they were worried about their grade, I realized at that point, like, this is not okay. And I'm part of that for them. And I knew that they would be fine in the end. But if I'm going to cause that kind of stress from a grade, I started thinking I have to do something different. And at that point, there were a couple people, including Matt, that were doing something different. So I ran with it. One thing I do want to make sure, like, I always call my system a non-traditional grading system instead of gradeless. We still have, because kids need to get scholarships and into college and all of those things, we still use a grade. We are required to enter a grade at the end of grading periods. And so we do that, and we've figured out ways to do that without using points and without every assignment having a point value or a number value on it.
Absolutely. I think that I want to go back to what you said about the stress levels. And do you think that the stress levels are higher now because of things like eSchool than they were when you were growing up? When there was that, you were talking sort of about, you had to go to the teacher and the teacher had to have averaged the grades. There was a physical book, right? And it had to be calculated. Do you think that eSchool do you think it's just accelerated a trend? Do you think it's caused a different trend? And for those who are unfamiliar, I'm sure most people who listen to this will be familiar, but online grading systems essentially allow students to check their grade in real time all the time.
And not just the student, but their parent as well. And that, I think, increases the stress for students too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what do we think about that as the kind of advent of these online programs that were made with, I think, the best of intentions, but I don't know if they've had the best of impact, truthfully?
Yeah, and I think the reason why we've wanted to go to them is so that parents can have a greater understanding of how their students doing in real time, right? Because what has happened in the past is students tell their parents, yeah, I'm doing great. It's fine. Got all my work turned in, and then come to find out, progress report time or whatever, that they're not being truthful. And I think a big reason why students might lie to their parents about their progress is because, when you have so much writing on it and you can't handle the stress of, like, if I don't do well on this assignment, then that could create all kinds of problems down the road for me. That's a lot of pressure. And then that continues to compound. And then, they want to lie about it because they don't want to admit that they have created this problem for themselves, or that they feel like they're inadequate and incapable. And I think that is really the where the stress comes from, right? So eSchool has exacerbated it, but it's also the rising cost of college and all of the weight that we continue to put on this quote unquote success that a student can have when it's really just measured by a transcript.
Yeah, and I think this makes me sound like even more of an old man than I am when I say things like social media, right? Like students are constantly comparing themselves to somebody. And not just that, like it would have been, I think when we were kids, like you hung out with your friends and that's pretty much who you knew. But like if you have social media and you can see, hey, this kid got like a scholarship, this kid did this, this peer did this or did that, and all of a sudden you are able to compare yourselves for worse. You're able to compare yourselves to everybody all of a sudden, and you see where you, again, if it's numbers, you see where you fall in that. And that's something that you see students accept. Like it becomes their identity that it's like, yeah, I'm a meh student. or I'm a great student. And it's again, that becomes who they are. And that's something else that's really sad is that is how they define themselves.
Yeah, that grades becoming the identity of a student it's a scary thought, but it's absolutely true because students do label themselves and they put themselves into these boxes all on their own. They look at grades and they look at social media and they see who's getting into what school or who's doing what post-secondary, who's on honor roll, who's doing this. And then they put themselves very naturally, I might add, into the hierarchy of where they fall because that's a very natural thing for people to do. Where's the hierarchy? Where do I fit? And it's not healthy for them because the hierarchy, they are not in direct competition with each other, even though the college system wants them to be the best student, to have the best GPA, to do the most extracurriculars. Really, school is an individual, you're in a classroom with other people, but really it's about you. It's about what you do. This week I interviewed, probably about 40 alt-ed students at Cook, and we talked at length about what Cook did for them. And a lot of them said, well, I kind of learned that my education's really about me, and nobody else really cared. I showed up here, I did my work, and all of a sudden, the adults cared, and they supported me, but I wasn't comparing myself. I was doing it, the best line was, I was doing it for me. It's like, yeah, it is for you. It's not for anybody else, right? It's not for, at the end of the day, it's not for your parents. It's not for your teachers. At the end of the day, it's for your own enrichment and for your own future. And I think sometimes in such a big school and in our modern age with this ability to check grades, we forget about that. And it's not emphasized that this really is for them.
I was going to say with because we've mentioned parents quite a few times. And when I first started to implement this, that was one of the concerns I had was, holy smokes, how am I going to explain this to parents during conferences? Because that, again, like historically, everybody has done the same grading system this entire time. And how do I explain to parents that I'm going to do something different? But the parent is also ultimately concerned is, what is the letter that's going to show up on this report card? So how do I explain this? I didn't get, or I should say, I got nothing but positive feedback from parents. When I explained to them, I said, hey, we want progress. I want them to be able to achieve these things. And, hey, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, but like, how do they improve? Where are they at the end? And when I ultimately tell parents, an average isn't necessarily fair, that if your child is crushing it at the end of the year, why should I say, well, at the beginning, when you first learned how to do something, when it's something you've never done before, you've never done this before, that is really going to impact, like, now that you're able to do it, and when I explain that to parents, I've had nothing but positive feedback from parents.
And I can just, to add on to that, as a parent myself, like, I don't care as much about the numbers and the missing assignments. And like what I care about is like, what is my son or daughter able to do? Are they learning? Are they able to interact well with their peers? Are they, asking good questions? Can they do the things? I want to know more about their skill set. And if I'm just looking at eSchool, I'm just seeing a bunch of numbers, and that doesn't tell me anything about how my student is actually doing. And so you mentioned earlier that many of your conferences with parents this week have been about, percentages and missing assignments and, how to get these assignments in. And I found the same thing before I went to an alternate system, that almost all of my parent-teacher conferences revolved around numbers. And since moving away from that, it revolves much more about skill set, how a student is actually doing, what they're thinking about, what is the thing that they're working on within the writing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that information is so much more valuable for me as a parent than trying to piece together, whatever information I can find from a grade book.
I had a conversation that something really stuck out to me. currently my students are working on something called Podcast for a Change, where they need to do a show, but it needs to be about a serious topic that they want to see change in the world, whether it's at school, whether it's in their lives, whether it's in politics, whatever they want to do. And they have to decide, and then they write about it, and it's a 15-minute show. They've been doing longer shows, but I didn't want to trap them in here doing a long show where they're not, maybe it's a topic they're not super comfortable with. So it's 15 minutes. And I was telling a parent about this. I think it's a great assignment. I'm really proud of it, and I think that the kids who have done it so far have done a great job. But what the parent said to me was, because it's shorter, are they going to get less points for this? And I thought, what a terrible mind. Like, I don't blame them, but like that's the mindset that we have. Yeah. Like, they miss the part where it's like talking about some change in the world, talking about real issues, not just coming in here and talking about random stuff, which they love to do. But I wanted to enforce, like, hey, this is a space where we come in, we talk about real issues sometimes. And to hear like, okay, are they going to get less points? Is it worth less? And I heard the same thing from students when they heard it was going to be shorter. Is it even worth doing it? It's like, of course it is. Of course it is. But
these are the kinds of things we no longer hear in our classrooms because they know it's not about points. It's not about, how much time is it going to take? It's not about, is this going to be on the test? It's more thinking of everything we do as practice to get better. And I as a sports enthusiast myself, I often think of it in that regard too. How many times do I practice before I actually play an actual game? Or how many free throws do I shoot? And we want to give our kids the opportunity to do that without any kind of a grade or number attached to it. And so it's been years since I've heard, how many points is this worth? Or is this going to be worth less? And that, I think, is just indicative of trying to change from a grade to learning.
So as a young teacher, it can be really scary to think about maybe doing this because you don't have that support of all those years that you were in school. You kind of know, what does an A student look like? What does a B student look like? What does a C student look like? You sort of have a rough understanding, whether right or not. I mean, it's very subjective, really. We've tried to make an objective system that at the end of the day is very subjective. And that was one thing that came up in the lectures that I've seen about this in a lot of the materials, is that we think of grades as being this very objective measurement of student progress when they couldn't be further from the truth. They're very biased. Even from student to student, the same work can get graded differently. But as a teacher, I know that. I know that my grades are subjective, and I know I can be biased, and I know I can grade things wrong, even from the presentation that I saw, from the top of the stack to the bottom of the stack. It's getting graded differently because I'm a human being, and there's no way that I can be that consistent all the way through. So what would your advice be to whether young or veteran teachers implementing these types of augmented systems? What's the advice? How do you get started? What supports are out there?
I think so. So I actually started, my credential is actually in teaching foreign language. And so one of the things that you do in that is you always say, what will my student be able to do after this class? And I think that's the first step that you have to take is you have to think about things as, what will my student be able to do? And saying, my student will be able to do this or do that. And then how are you going to measure that? And then I think even more importantly is then not just how do you measure that, but I look at things as being like building blocks almost, where it's like you need, A, B, and C to get to that objective. So then what we start telling the students is, hey, you got A, but you need to work on B and C. And the student can see what B and C are, and they know what they do. So if somebody wants to or is thinking about creating this, I think that that's what you have to look at, is you have to look at, okay, I want my students to be able to do this. What are the steps that students are going to have to take or be able to achieve to get to that? And, that's how I would break down, feedback or rubrics or what you're going to tell students. So I think that's to me, that's the first step is what I want them to be able to do. What are the steps that they have to take to get to that point? And that's what you're ultimately going to measure as feedback and where they are.
And I think oftentimes when we look at classes as this accumulation of content, it's harder to visualize how an ungraded system might work because everything sort of builds on itself and it's very linear. And I think if you can approach your class and think about the skill sets that students are learning and how those skill sets cross all of the different units, all of the different content areas that you're going to be teaching within a year, I think now you can focus in on growth and you can focus in on what a proficient skill set, whether that's in writing or reading or, mathematic reasoning or whatever that might be, right? You need to be very clear about what those skill sets are so that you can communicate that to students. And I think the next step then is having students select their own goals, growth goals. And it's not just my goals, but then it becomes me helping them to guide their own learning as opposed to me telling them, like, you need to walk this path.
I agree with everything these guys are saying, but I'm going to take a different approach to this question about what advice would I give. I would say find somebody else who's doing something like this and pick their brain, use them as a mentor. And I would say go out and find everything you can about it. There are groups on social media like Teachers Going Gradeless. There are teachers that have wrote anecdotal books, but there's also a ton of quantitative data that also supports these sorts of systems. I found a math department at Gonzaga who had spelled out some of the things they did that was non-traditional, and I stole some of that. I stole some of Matt's stuff. I was watching TED Talks. I found other people that were doing something like what I wanted to do to help me then create what I was going to do. And that would be my biggest advice, is find other people to journey with, because it can feel lonely when you know the entire system uses a 100-point scale.
And I think also, looking at what other people have done, because I plagiarize everything from what Matt and Erin have done. But no, that ultimately what you make is your own. And I think that's important, because even though we're all gradeless, we do things a little bit differently. And I think it's really important to be able to say, here's what I do and here's why, and here's why I'm asking you to do this. And I think sometimes there might be a fine line of am I being inspired by what somebody else does and looking at what other people do and again, building my own stuff from that, and then just taking something. And then, if you're not able to clarify or describe it, I think that's problematic.
I think that's a great point, Erik, because you've used the things that we've done to create your own system, but you own your system. And I think it's really hard when, Kyle, for example, if you were to look at what we do and you're like, okay, I'm going to use it without making it your own, then it doesn't come across to students as authentic. And I think it makes it, sometimes the kids then feel more stressed because they don't quite understand exactly what's going on. And when I first started, my goals were to over-communicate with students and parents because I knew that it was going to look different for them. And now I don't have to over-communicate. It's just a sort of normal. I haven't had zero pushback from parents in the last 3 or 4 years.
I think all of these points are important, and I can't agree more with the idea of finding somebody to kind of help you through the system, and doing this with somebody, finding somebody that you can talk through with them. But I would also say that, echoing Erik's point, it's not gonna work right for you if you don't take a system and make it your own. You really have to design it for what best fits your own teaching style, for what best fits the classes that you're going to be teaching. And if you can't design it around your own skill set, you're just trying to do what other people are doing, and you can never quite get to that place where it needs to be. And this analogy is going to date me a little bit, but you guys know the Wile E. Coyote cartoons, right? He's always trying to catch the roadrunner, and that's what we're always striving for as teachers, is the perfect system and the perfect year, and yet he can never get there. But he's always trying something different, Every single time it's something new, and nothing's going to be perfect. But I think iteration is such an important part of this, where, every year, this time of the year, it's important to reflect and make adjustments and make changes, and not to just fall back on, well, this is what I did last year, so this is what it's going to be forever.
And working with students in tandem, instead of it being a top-down system, getting feedback from kids. What do you need? What would help you? How does this work for you? And they're really, when Matt first started using this, it was a student who helped him create it. And it's because they get it. They know the stresses and they get the system, and they have learned to play the game for so long that they know. And so using students for feedback is important too.
Actually, I was just about to say that is that part of it is involving the students. And it's really like you ask the student, you say, hey, how do you think you're doing? And sometimes part of that is, again, like if a student is, and you see the student doing this, but if a student is just grinding and you can see the student working so hard, and, if it were a traditional system and you say, the student earns a B or something like that, versus a student that can just breeze through everything and they earn an A, if we're looking at this, again, by skills and how students are improving, why is it that the student that, again, is just, maybe this is a student that comes in before school, or they're constantly asking you for feedback. Like, why should that student be, well, you're not as good as the other student? Like why? Where does that come from? So when you ask students, hey, how do you think you did? Students are honest. Like, students know.
Incredibly honest.
Well, and how frustrating is it as a student to be working your butt off and then see the kid next to you that barely does anything, and yet they're getting a better grade than you.
Right. Talk about demotivating, right? It's back to being demotivating.
Absolutely. Okay, let's kind of shift gears a little bit, and let's consider some of the misconceptions that teachers have about this. As an educator in a big building with a lot of other teachers, I hear a lot about it, especially as I was kind of getting ready for this podcast and talking to people about it. There are misconceptions. After talking to you guys for 42 minutes, we've scratched the surface. I'm sure there's so much more below. But what are some of those misconceptions that you hear? And would you like to dispel some of those myths and kind of, no system is perfect. And I think that we've done a good job saying that this is a non-perfect system that we are using, and this alternate system does have flaws. But maybe let's dispel some of the myths that surround it, especially as it pertains to, we're all high school teachers. So especially at a high school level, what do you kind of see with that?
One of the first things I think about is people assume that it's subjective, but I have way more data now than I ever did before. And Erik touched on this earlier, the idea of like, what does a point even mean? I used to be like, okay, this assignment's probably worth 25 points. And that was so arbitrary. There was no reason for it other than, that's about right. And now I have data that shows what percentage of work is turned in. I have data that it shows me what standards kids are meeting or nearly meeting, whether they're proficient or not. I have so much more data. And then, this idea of subjectivity, I think people just assume because there aren't numbers, it's subjective. But I would disagree with that. And then the other thing I sometimes hear is we meet with our students before a grade is determined. We ask them how they think they're doing, what they've learned. And so I've heard people say, well, you let kids negotiate for their grade. And I also don't think that is true. Kids are not negotiating. They're coming to me saying, Mrs. Brisbin, these are the things I have learned. This is where I started. This is how much I've grown. I didn't know this before, and I know now. It's nothing about negotiating. It's them being able to actually tell me what they've learned. And then we talk about like, okay, you've met the standards here. This is the growth we've seen over time, which we have on a sheet. You can actually see it. And so just because we meet with students and have these sort of grade meetings doesn't mean we're letting kids negotiate. And to piggyback on what Erik said a few minutes ago, kids are incredibly honest, and they almost always evaluate themselves lower than I would.
Yeah, I think to build off that a little bit, I think that in my own research, getting ready for this show, I came across, I finally found the name. It's Jenny Momsen at North Dakota State, and talking about how grading systems are biased. And I think that those pushbacks with the meetings and the subjectivity, I think it implies two things that I think are wrong. And I think the biggest thing is that number grades are objective, which I think is totally false. And the other thing I think that it implies is that language can't have objectivity, which is also completely untrue. Of course language can have objectivity. Of course it can be. Of course a statement can be true. And so a conversation with a student, yes, there is discussion and there is talk going on, but that doesn't mean that talk is inherently untrue. And it also does not mean that numbers are objective. Numbers can be very misleading.
What do you mean? There's only one answer to a math problem. How can that be objective? Or subjective, rather?
I had, and think of this is another thing that I always hated multiple choice tests or giving multiple choice tests, and actually I hated them myself too. But like, how many times would you have a student that's like, oh, how'd you get to 100%? I don't know. I guessed on the 15 of these. Do you know which ones you got right? I have no idea. Which was, I don't know. I just started abacadabra down the form, And I actually had a student that said, after the first month or so, I'll say, hey, how do you feel about this system? And I had a kid this year say, well, I don't know, like I feel like the numbers, like I know how much better I'm doing with the numbers. And I said, really? Like, how do you know, like, if you have an 86% on something, how do you know what you need to do to get to 90%? And they go, I don't know. I said, okay, well, look at this. I'm asking you to do this. How do you get from this step to the next step? And she said, well, I have to do this here. And I said, yeah. And she said, oh. So yeah, and it's again, this is this whole interacting with students, and I think that again, the misconception of students get to pick their grade. I think that if you build in, like, here's what it is I'm looking for, that you talk to the student, you say, how are you doing? And you still can say, can you do these things, right? Look at these things that I'm asking you to do. Are you able to successfully do them? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the measurements. So it's not, subjective in the same way.
I think one of the reasons why it's so much more objective than a traditional grading system is you get to triangulate your data, right? In a typical grading system, you have a percentage, an average of assignments that are turned in over time, and you look at that percentage and that determines your grade. But I think the other piece of this is, some people just assume that because, we should probably change the term gradeless, because it's not like we're not grading anything.
That's a myth all in itself.
We're still giving feedback. We're doing all of the work that a teacher would normally do. And we're still tracking the data of how a student grows in that particular skill set or these multiple skill sets over the course of the year. And so because we have that data, we also are asking the student how they feel like they have done. And so we are able to listen to their own reasoning, and the students get to provide their own perspective on their learning growth and their journey, which is different than my perspective. And so that's another data point. Mm-hmm. And then I think the other thing is just, there are things that are outside of our control that happen throughout the school year that will affect a student's performance in a given month or a given week of the school year. And I think having that context helps us to have a better understanding of how a student is truly doing. Mm-hmm. Are they just not understanding something, or, have they been in the hospital for a week? And I think unless you have these conversations, unless you are checking in with students, unless you are giving them more of a voice in the system, you won't know. Yeah, and it's hard to differentiate between those things.
Yeah, I think that overall we can't underestimate how important the human aspect is, which is something that letter grades and scales out of 100 really do. I mean, they do really ignore the human side of things. And unless you are going in and changing things based upon that, which has its own equity problems on its own, those things don't get accounted for. And it's unfair both ways. It's unfair to students who you do change things for. You were in the hospital. Okay, I'll excuse this or I'll do that. It's a equity problem the other way to people who maybe didn't speak up. But it's also a problem if you don't do it, because then it's not representative of who the person really is or the challenges that they've been facing. Let's kind of hop over to this idea of tracking progress as we kind of sort of coast our way here to the end. And we should really drop that. It's kind of funny that the system is so tied to grades that even in the absence of grades, we still call it gradeless, right? We can't even imagine a system not tied to grades. We still have to just call it gradeless. Jenny Momsen over at NDSU again called it ungrading, which is an even worse name somehow. So obviously, naming department need to hire some people in the naming department. But what do you think about tracking progress? Tell the audience a little bit about how you track progress in an ungrading or gradeless, not really a gradeless, but in a system that decentivizes numbers, let's say. How do we tell a student without additional stress on educators, right? It would be awesome if all of us could meet with every student after every assignment, tell them exactly what they did wrong and what they could do better. But it's just not possible given the American education system. The number of students per teacher, it's just not possible, right? So what does it look like then for this type of system as opposed to, like you were saying at the beginning of the podcast, you would grade essays, you'd put that letter on the top, and then that's where it stops. So instead of that letter, what do we do?
I had to laugh a little bit because I actually call it a progress tracker. So like I was saying, I really go out of my way to never use the word grade. So I tell students like, okay, I use a skill build system. I don't know if that sounds cheesy. I made it up, or I say that I use the skill build system, whatever. But so I actually have a spreadsheet, which I make spreadsheets all the time. So I actually have a spreadsheet where I have, on the Y, sort of columns is the just student ID numbers, right? And then I have all the assignments. And again, the way I measure it is I say that a student is either they're not on target, meaning they're not hitting the things we're looking for. They're partially meeting target. So like I was saying before, that I look for, can they do this skill that they need to show 1, 2, and 3 to be able to do this skill. So partially meeting, right, they've shown me they can do 1, right? And then they're close to target or they're on target. And then I actually also have an exceeding target, but I actually intentionally, I'll have that on there. And students always want to visualize ABC, so I intentionally put like the exceeding target at the bottom. So I'll say like it's here, and it's target is there, and then exceeding target, and I purposely shift it to the bottom. But so I stole this from Erin also's color coding, right? So how students are doing, if you're not on target, it's orange, and there's again, trying to get away from also the letters, right? So I have a little asterisk that's there, and it's, if it's close to target, it's a little arrow, and the letter T and whatever. So students try to get away from, ABC, but they can pull up that progress tracker whenever they want, and they can look at their assignments, and they can see, I think the colors are the one thing, right? They see I'm going from orange to yellow to green to blue, and exceeding is actually pink, right? And so you can visually, the student can visualize what's my average? I don't know, but I can see that I was, orange to yellow to blue. And that's how I track it. And again, that's another thing that I've never heard pushback from parents or anybody to say like, yeah, this is what we do, and this is what students can follow.
And I think the visual of the colors, because I use a similar system with a spreadsheet and a color-coded system, just seeing the growth, like you don't even have to try to crunch any numbers in your head. You can just see it on the page in front of you. And I think that part is outstanding.
It's outstanding for the educator too, because I pull that up and I can go from second to sixth period and be like, wow, sixth period's got this. I must need to do something different in second period, because you can see the specific. And I do the same thing, but I also will put the assignment and tie it to what standard it is. And then the actual coding I use looks a little different than Erik, but it's the same thing. And then we all use eSchool, and what we do for that is it's just the percentage of work completed. So if you turn something in, you get the point in there, because we're trying to avoid points. But that way parents can also look at eSchool and go, okay, my kid has 7 missing things, right? And students can do that too. We use an L for if things are late, it still gives them credit for like the percentage of work completed, but it also helps us and students know, like, I'm turning in all my stuff late. Is that really indicative of an A learner? So.
And I think the growth, the emphasis on growth, right, is something that we miss with an online gradebook with just math, is you only see averages and you don't see the progression necessarily unless you are really looking for it. And so with the color coding system, it just jumps off the page at you. Yeah.
And again, like, I feel like I have fewer and fewer people looking at eSchool, and I don't even get like I won't even, we just having conferences, I won't even get a question from parents when they look at it and they see that their kid has turned in 36% of the work. That's not great, right? And that'll be reflected in the progress tracker, but at the same time, nobody says anything about it being 36%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But a percentage of work turned in is objective, right?
Sure.
There is no lie to it, right? Whereas grades are not. So that's interesting. I hate to stop a good conversation as we go. We've gone for 56 minutes. We could go for another 5 hours, I think. But it is 10:06. So I think we'll go ahead and stop here so you can make your conference. I think we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah.
Thanks so much
Thanks,
for the
Kyle.
opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
And we really, really appreciate the input. And it's so great to hear about this. And I can't wait to talk more about it another day. So thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Kyle.